Hello RGL3300 students, Dr. Conway here to resume our course for the term. I hope you had a good break, as much of a break as you could in any case. We're now starting with lesson 7 on standardization, conformity assessment, and mutual recognition of product standards. But before I get into that in a great deal of detail, just to let you know that after we get through this week, I don't want to do it this week because you still have your midterm for RGL3000. But next week I'll be issuing a new rubric for part 2 of your term papers for this course, okay? But for this week, let's just get through the quiz you have for RGL3000 on Wednesday and the RGL3000 midterm. And then we'll pick up from there, all right? So today we're going to talk a little bit about standardization, conformity assessment, and mutual recognition of product standards. And this builds on the discussion we had in lesson 6 on trade and the control of hazardous products, okay? And what we can and cannot do with regulations in an international trading context. And in that lecture, I talked about how the international community, primarily to comply with the TBT and SPS agreements, was to work with international standards. So today we're going to talk about these international standards and how we assess conformity and mutual recognition of these standards on an international basis. Okay, and why is this important to post-market surveillance? Well, when we do post-market surveillance, think about the Canadian economy now, right? What's on the Canadian market at any given time? Is every one of these products produced in Canada? Of course not, right? Many of them can be hazardous products, but they're produced abroad. So why is it in the post-market surveillance interest to know about international standards? Because before we let these products into our country, they need to comply with our national regulations. But once in our country, they also become part of the post-market surveillance scope that we need to come to grips with, all right? And so, all regulators need to understand what international standards are and how they work and so on, all right? So, and it's important to understand some key concepts about this. The slides are very clear, so I'm not going to go into detail in the slides, but I'm going to hit some key points that I want you to be aware of, right? So, first off, a standard is a document that outlines how a product should be made or perform, or a process or practice should be conducted. In other words, it can deal with standard can deal with products, but it can also deal with processes and manufacturing systems or production systems. And so that's really important, because if we want to influence how international governments behave with respect to products or services that will be coming into Canada, we have an interest to adopt international standards so that all of that regulatory burden does not fall to us at the border, but rather there is a way of understanding whether a product or service is in compliance with an international standard, okay? And it's also important for students of regulation to understand that standards and regulations are not the same thing. Okay? You learned about this last term. Standards are voluntary instruments, okay? In other words, they're industry-inspired and government cooperation-inspired standards that we expect products to adhere to. But that being said, they're not regulations per se. They're not law. They're voluntary standards, more or less. For example, when I say less, I mean they don't have the force of law of a regulation, right? But they're more because how many big industries want to try to compete with other products that are in direct competition with them if they don't hold the international standard, all right? So market forces provides a certain authority to international standards that isn't in law, okay? So it's important that we not be simplistic one way or the other on these types of things, okay? And standards perform an important role for us as citizens as well, right? We know that, for example, that when we go shopping, we look for these standard marks, or at least I do. I look for energy efficiency. I look for other standards. When I go buy wood, I'm looking for the Forest Stewardship Council standard stamp on it, this kind of stuff. I do that consciously because I'm trained in the area, so I know how to do it consciously. But a lot of citizens don't realize that that's happening, but large retailers look for those standards. Okay, Home Depot, will put Forest Stewardship Council wood on their shelves. Most appliance retailers will look for some kind of an energy efficiency standard, and so on. So even if the citizens, the consumers, are not conscious of it, the retailers are. All right. So these standards reassure consumers that products, systems, and organizations are safe and reliable. They draw on industry expertise and experience when developing regulations applicable to available standard. In other words, when standards are set, okay, they're set not by a single organization. They're set certainly not by a single group, but they're established by international cooperation. So industry and government representatives from all over the world who want to participate in that standard because they have a national interest in that standard, they will go and they will meet in the ISO, for example, the International Standards Organization, to develop a standard in this area. In Canada, our participation is coordinated by the Standards Council of Canada. Okay, the Standards Council of Canada coordinates standardization in Canada and is ultimately responsible for approving all standards, although they do not develop standards themselves. They are the oversight body for voluntary industry standards in Canada. Okay, and standards are developed themselves by standards development organizations. Okay, so for example, if there's an international meeting for a new ISO standard, then the Standards Council of Canada will coordinate what Canadian experts should participate. And usually that would be some leading industry representatives and probably a government department representative if the standard is particularly relevant to a class of Canadian regulations or to another strategic economic interest of Canada. So our delegation would go over to these meetings and participate in the ISO development. And one of those representatives would likely be a standards development organization, a representative from a standards development organization. And these are accredited by the SCC, all right? It's important for you to understand this too, because these organizations, of which there are many, also become interesting employment prospects, okay? Now, the Canadian Standards Association, for example, okay, is accredited by the SCC as a standards development organization and a certification organization. Two different things, but they have both accreditation. A certification organization has expertise in methodologies for providing assurance that control systems conform to requirements. In other words, they confirm whether a product or a process is in fact in conformity with an agreed standard. Okay. On one of the slides in your lesson, I have the URL for the directories for these two different types of organization. So as I said, the SCC represents, okay, represents Canada in the establishing of international standards. Okay, so Canada sends over a delegation, and that can be to the International Organization for Standardization, the ISO, the International Electrotechnical Commission, the IEC, and these types of organizations that develop international standards. Okay, you can follow this along on the slides. I'm not pulling up the slides today, but you have the slides. All right. Now, and international cooperation, of course, as we discussed in lesson 6, is all about making sure that we do not have to enforce a battery of requirements at the border, right? And at the same time, we also do not want to create unnecessary trade frictions. So if we establish international standards and a bunch of countries who are importing products or services into Canada are in compliance with that standard, it substantially reduces the post-market surveillance requirements that we have for products to enter the country. And it substantially reduces trade frictions between countries because we're all adhering to the same international standards. All right? So it's very important to understand those particular roles, okay? And of course, when we're dealing with international standards, we're always concerned that those international standards both protect public health and the environment, but also are in fact achievable by industry. So why does Canada care? If the industry is already, if the ISO is already doing that, or some other international standards body is already doing that, we can just stay home and save money, right? No, but because with international standards we have economic interests and we have public health and environmental protection interests. You can protect the environment and public health in ways that may limit Canada's industry technical capacities, okay? So Canada is interested in achieving those environmental and public health goals, but we're interested in achieving it in a way that does not distinctly disadvantage our industry relative to a competitive country's industry, all right? So we have a dual interest in participating in international standard setting. Yes, to assure the public that everything is safe and so on, but also to make sure that when we're doing that in a way that does not unfairly disadvantage the Canadian industry, all right? So that's important to understand those roles, okay? International cooperation can occur in various venues, as I said, but the ISO is obviously the biggest one, but we're also participating in the Codex Alimentarius Commission. We participate in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, the International Telecommunications Union, and so on. International cooperation on international standards is a large industry in and of itself nowadays, okay? So it's important there's slides in there that you can review what these organizations are all about, all right? Now, there's still the question of how do we know that a product, a product can have a mark on it as an international standard, but how do we know that is in fact it is in conformity with that international standard? Well, for example, an international standard is a document that outlines exactly how a product should be made or perform, or the performance characteristics of a production or management system. Okay, but how do we know? You can have a mark on there, and without any post-market surveillance, you don't know whether that mark is legitimate or not legitimate. Okay, generally they are, but you still have to determine somehow. You have to post-market surveil the international standard and its compliance as well. If a product arrives at our border and has a stamp on it, the border control guys are not experts. They'll go, oh, the stamp's in, okay, fine, in you go. But at the end of the day, somebody needs to be responsible for ensuring that, in fact, those products with the standardization stamp are, in fact, in conformity. All right, and so that is a whole different industry in and of itself. There are many organizations that participate in this activity. Okay. Conformity to international standards, we need to be able to ensure that, because consumers are relying on this standardization, this mark, that the product systems and organizations are safe, reliable, and good for the environment and public health, right? That they draw on international expertise, right? Those standards are there because international experts agreed that this is how you achieve that standard, all right? And these standards are released with not only a document that says this is what the standard is and this is how you conform with the standard, but they're also released with a document or documents that say this is how you determine conformity assessment with that standard. And so there are conformity assessment organizations out there that primarily do this as their business. There are networks of professionals, regulators, and other stakeholders that will participate in doing conformity assessments, okay? These can be individuals and organizations who produce important market products. They can have their own certification to do these conformity assessments. Organizations that conduct conformity assessments as their core business. There are organizations out there that's what they do. Okay, they determine conformity assessments with international standards. There are consumer advocacy groups that do this work, public health advocacy groups, and so on, that once becoming certified to do so, they can do conformity assessments. Provincial, territorial, and federal government departments can participate in conformity assessments, and they will typically do so in areas that are particularly sensitive to issues of environment and public health. Okay. So any of these certified conformity assessment entities, I say entities because they can be individuals, professors can be responsible for doing conformity assessments, as well as large organizations and consulting firms. So we call it the entity, okay? They are charged with tests of the finished product or product samples, audits of the entire production cycle to check whether proper procedures are followed. They can be responsible for doing that. Okay, inspections of physical factory facilities. They can be sent to do inspections. Okay, if there's a question as to whether the standard is being entirely adhered to. But once there's a conformity assessment completed, then the mark is validated. Either the mark is provided because the conformity assessment is done before the mark is issued. Okay, the ISO standard mark is issued, or a conformity assessment can be done on products or services that have the mark, but the government decides that it wants to take a look at whether the conformity assessment is completely comprehensive. That can occur, for example, when we're not sure whether best laboratory practices or something are being followed, even though the product has been issued a mark by its national standard setting body. We want to confirm that for ourselves, and so we do a conformity assessment. So conformity assessment can occur in a number of different fashions depending upon whether in post-market surveillance we are alerted to any concerns, okay? Now there's another class, there's conformity assessment, but there's also mutual recognition. It's important to understand the two. Mutual recognition is particularly important because it sets up a recognition cooperation agreement between countries. For example, if the United States agrees that this pharmaceutical is safe, Canada will typically take it and provide it with its own registration in Canada without doing the full clinical trials, the full pre-market approval process, because we have a conformity assessment agreement with the United States and the EU with respect to pharmaceuticals. Okay, these are agreements that are put in place where each of the countries accepts that in the preponderance your standards are basically the same as ours. Okay, there may be a few niggly differences, but on the weight of it is that our standards are basically the same, okay? And the pre-market approval processes for this class of products is expensive. It's takes up a lot of time and creates a lot of market uncertainty and so on, right? So we agree that let's not do that. Let's reach an agreement that our systems are basically close enough, like 90% close enough in what we look for in pre-market approval, that when you approve a drug in Germany, the Canadian system is going to look at that and provide it with a reasonable registration number, unless there's some reason why that is, some exceptional reason why that mutual recognition should not be provided. For example, during COVID-19, you'll notice that we abandoned mutual recognition over some of the so-called hypothetical COVID-19 pharmaceuticals, or in this case, actually testing methods, right? Where the government of Canada would not accept the testing methods that were easily adopted by the United States and even some of them in Europe, because the Canadian government determined that, through its own conformity assessment, we determined that these testing methods were incorrect more often than not. And so even though there was an acceptance of those in the United States and in Europe, Canada would not accept them because we believe that the reason that they were so quickly adopted in the United States and Europe was due to political pressure. Remember, we had Italy and Spain with astronomical numbers of COVID-19 cases and so on. There was a lot of political pressure in Europe. In the United States, with Donald Trump, he was approving anti-malarial drugs, for heaven's sakes, for curing COVID-19. I mean, he was completely off the handle with this stuff. So the Canadian government basically abandoned mutual recognition at that point and said, no, we're going to be running our own tests on these. And as it turned out, we denied acceptance of those products in Canada, and we were proven to be correct. They were proven to be faulty at very high percentages. So mutual recognition is something we use as an agreement, but that doesn't mean a country cannot notified and pull back from a mutual recognition in certain areas because of its own national concerns. But mutual recognition serves a very important purpose, because when we have highly integrated economies dealing with chemical classes of products, like we have with Canada, United States, and Mexico, and the North American trading bloc with the European trading bloc, that it's advantageous for us to rather than assess individual product standards or process standards, okay, to rather assess each other's regulatory regime and say, you know what, overall, we're in substantial agreement that this is the criteria that the product must meet to enter into our market. So we're going to mutually recognize that if you adopt it as safe in the United States, we'll do the same in Canada. If you adopt it as safe in Europe, we'll do the same in Canada, and vice versa. But in exceptional cases, as I was just pointing out to you, in exceptional cases, you can find a situation where that mutual recognition is withdrawn, which is what happened in Canada during COVID-19 for testing of COVID-19. And you remember perhaps the Alberta Premier saying, "Oh, are you telling me," and talking about the federal government, that, if something was accepted in the United States and something was accepted in Europe, Canada won't accept it and we can't use it? And the federal health minister had to come out and say, yeah, that's exactly what we're saying. Because at the end of the day, they were correct, that the mutual recognition should not have been permitted in that particular instance. And as it turns out, the evidence would indicate that we were in fact correct on that. Okay, so it's important to understand the difference between conformity assessment and mutual recognition, because they both have important roles to play in post-market surveillance, right? Because once a product comes onto our market, when we do post-market surveillance of pharmaceuticals in Canada, a lot of those pharmaceuticals are never produced in Canada, all right? A lot of those, a lot of other chemical products that we now fall under our post-market surveillance regime were never produced in Canada, okay? But we now are in charge of post-market surveilling them. So can you imagine a situation where we didn't have international standards, we didn't have, conformity assessment, we didn't have mutual recognition frameworks, and we had to do post-market surveillance then? It would be extremely difficult and would create enormous problems at the border. Because remember, border agents, they're not experts in chemicals. They're not experts in these matters. And so we need to have other mechanisms to ensure that the standards that the border agencies, the stamp that the border agencies, or the paper that travels with the product at the border, is in fact reflecting the actual circumstance that's going on. And so we need conformity assessment and mutual recognition as a post-market surveillance area of work. Okay? So on that, go through the slides, because the slides are very straightforward, that's why I didn't have them up on the screen, but I want to get the key messages to you with this verbal presentation. All right? So we'll talk to you on the Zoom call tomorrow. Don't forget that we have the co-op office coming on board on our July 7th Zoom call, which is tomorrow at 4 o'clock. And so if you have any questions for them, we'll listen to their update and so on, all right? And we'll go from there. And so I'll talk to you tomorrow at 4 o'clock on our Zoom call, all right? Take care for now, and welcome back from the break. Bye-bye now.